Hey everyone, what's happening? Welcome to Normal America Show. We have a good one for you today. My guest today is the president of American Commitment, which is dedicated to restoring and protecting free markets, economic growth, and limited government and property rights. The great Phil Kerpin, who I also knew from my days in debate, so it's always a pleasure to talk to him. How you doing today, Phil?
I'm doing great, Rob. How are you?
I can't complain at all. It's We're having problems with some of the dumb technology in the background. I
Yeah.
can't keep up with our brilliance, so but we got it working. You're here today to talk about. I saw this op-ed you wrote, and it's interesting because I think it's on something that people would intuitively think, "Oh, Trump's doing a really good thing here," which is going along with sort of Dick Durbin and Senator Warren about capping credit cards. It's very popular to hate the credit card industry, so you had some thoughts on why it's probably not a good thing that Trump's going along with these Democrat socialists to be able to like do something like this going after the banks.
Yeah, you can't, as a conservative, you can't compete with the liberals when it comes to bashing the big banks or bashing corporations or sort of, cracking down on market actors. It's a pretty dangerous path to go down. Trump came out with this idea. He said, we're going to do an interest rate cap of 10% just for 1 year to help dig out of the mess that we had under Biden. And he mentioned it on the campaign trail, and then it sort of was gone for a while. Then he mentioned it again in a truth post, I think, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, something like that. And you might think, well, okay, it's only for 1 year, so it's not really going to destroy the business model. They're not going to cancel everyone's cards over 1 year. I get what he's doing. It's a one-time thing to try to dig out of Biden. The problem is what happens as soon as he announced it. Bernie Sanders introduced the bill and says, oh, if 1 year is good, let's do it for 6 years. And his bill is for 6 years. And I think that once you start going down this path, even if you say it's going to be temporary, it ends up being extended and extended and extended. And then you have all the same problems you would have if you just imposed an outright price control, which is you disrupt, you upend the business model that underlies credit cards. They've got a cost of capital to raise the funds that they lend out. That's about 4%. They've got administrative costs and overhead and labor costs and all of that. That's another 4 or 5% of gross margins. And then they've got all the bad debts that they have to write off. Because remember, a credit card is an unsecured loan. It's not like an auto loan or a home loan where you can get repossessed or, foreclosed. There's no collateral. And so, if you don't pay your credit card bills, they'll send you nasty letters and they'll light up your credit file. And, that's about it, right? And you could eventually declare bankruptcy and
Right.
not pay, or they end up writing off a bad loan. And so, their business model has to make enough money on interest coming in to cover, their capital costs, their labor costs, and those bad loans that they have. And that interest rate on an annualized basis where the business kind of works, it's 15% plus. And, in fact, the credit unions, the federal credit unions, not state credit unions, but federal credit unions had a 15% annualized interest rate cap on credit cards. And they ended up getting it increased to 18% because at 15%, they really couldn't make the business work that well. And so, I'm not a fan of price controls in general. I'd rather let markets figure out pricing. But if you do impose price controls, you can't set the number way below the market rate without massive disruption. And, I saw one estimate that if we had, this is permanent, not, the temporary, but if we had a permanent 10% annual interest rate cap on credit cards, nobody would be able to get a credit card with a score under 740, which is like 80 or 85% of people basically would no longer have access to credit cards. And you think about the implications of that for consumer spending, for the economy overall, for just from a household standpoint, what do you do if you have an emergency expense that exceeds your savings and you no longer have access to credit cards? Your only options are going to be worse than credit cards. And so, I'm sympathetic to people who find themselves in a lot of credit card debt, and it is very expensive if you carry that debt long term. But the idea of government price controls, I think once you start going down that path, the Democrats end up always outbidding you. And the other thing is they don't care if they destroy a private industry. I remember a few years ago, AOC and Bernie Sanders introduced a version of this, and I think it was 15 at the time, not 10. And, one of the questions from the press was like, what happens if banks can't make this work? If consumer lending doesn't work anymore with this? And one of them, I don't remember which one, but one of them kind of said, oh, we'll just replace it with a government program. no problem. We'll just, consumer lending will be done through the post office, and we don't need private consumer lending. And that's a pretty scary scenario if you look at what they've done on student loans. If you think about how they would forgive government consumer loans around election time and do it for favored groups and all the other manipulation that would go on. And so I think, if you're a liberal, there's no limit to how far you're going to push regulation because you don't care about destroying an industry. If you're a conservative, it's much more difficult to calibrate something like this, and then you get outbid by the liberals. And so I think it's a dangerous path to go down. I will note, the president mentioned this, and then, I think he said they better do it by January 20th or else. And then that date came and went, and I don't think he's actually done anything. So this may have just been more kind of trying to talk them into lower rates or offer promotional rates or do something like that, rather than actually trying to impose some regulation or legislation. But I do worry that it opens the door for people like Bernie and AOC. And reportedly he already talked to Elizabeth Warren about what a great idea this is that they agree on. So anytime Trump's getting ideas from them instead of from people like us, I do worry.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, the politics of it, right? Because you talk to people who are like, oh, well, let's say that this would be popular. The problem is you're never going to sort of go after the banks more than Democrats.
Yeah.
If Trump would agree to this plan, they'll just be like, not only 6 years, let's do it in perpetuity, plus let's limit them to 5%.
Yeah, or
And
whatever.
so
Yeah, I mean,
it'll never end.
You can't win a contest of who regulates an industry more and more aggressively against people who do not care if they destroy that industry.
Right.
Right. And I think that's the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in your op-ed, one of the examples you put, and I thought the two things that were most striking is what you just said there, that we're talking about more than 70% of people that currently have credit cards would probably lose it, which is ridiculous when you think about it, because if you're using a credit card responsibly, it's actually a very important tool. And it's something that a lot of families, including lower income families, use responsibly, and it ends up really helping them get through their month. The idea that just the 10% cap, would limit over 70% of people from getting the card. I mean, that's basically rewriting the industry as we know it and changing the financial look of how average families live day to day.
Yeah, that was an estimate from the Electronic Payments Coalition that they think the cutoff under a 10% cap would be about a 740 credit score. I've seen some other estimates that are lower that think it could be somewhere in the 600s. And so, I don't know for sure whether it's going to be, 70% plus of people or it's going to be 50% of people, but it's going to be a very large number just based on those economics that I ran through at the top. Sort of the way the cost structure works in that industry, at a 10% cap, you basically can't have almost any bad loans. You need to have an almost perfect collection record because your cost of capital and your administrative costs are almost 10% by themselves. So they're probably around 8%, something like that. And so you've got to have a tiny, tiny default rate for the business to work at 10%. And so the underwriting standards would tighten a lot. Now, I don't know if anyone knows exactly how much. And as I said, I've seen some different estimates, but I mean, if you're sub 700, you're probably not going to be able to get a credit card with that in place, and maybe it'll be as high as 740, like that estimate from Electronic Payments Coalition.
Yeah, and like you put there, like, okay, so then what would those people do? Well, the options they would have, what? The payday advance loan people? Where the rates are up.
Your state hasn't banned them yet.
Right? And that's the issue. Like, if you don't think if they're capping this, they're not going to come after the payday advance loan in the future.
You know what your option is, Rob? It's going to be what it was, 30 years ago, which is, you write a check that is for more money that's in your account, and then you just hope against hope that it doesn't get cashed before payday.
Yep, that's exactly it.
That's about all. That's about your only option to bridge that gap, unless you have a payday loan or a credit card.
Now, I think that probably, in my opinion, the front runner for the Democratic candidate in 2028 is going to be Gavin Newsom. And I remember back in 2012, 2013, there was this interview with this comedian Adam Carolla, where he's talking about the payday advance loan stuff to Gavin Newsom. And it sort of illustrates this point where for them, it's just axiomatic. It's like, yeah, payday advance loan, it's bad, it's racist. It targets like minority communities that make less money. Adam Carolla's like, what do you mean? What is it specifically about this that targets, I think that it illustrates the point here of what you're saying, which is so many of these Democrats, it's like they don't think through it. In fact, they're antithetical to the banking industry in the first place. So for them, it's just like, yeah, it's like a Trojan horse to, so what? If it leads to banning these practices for everyone, that's good for us. The damage that would do, particularly to lower and middle income people, is immense because there wouldn't be options left. And so I think that you're right. Not only would it lead to credit cards being out of reach for millions of Americans, but then whatever the next phase would be, they're just going to seek to ban that and make it illegal till we end up, I guess, in their Soviet dream where no one can afford their bills, and then we don't have to
Or
worry
you know
about it.
what they really want, Rob, is they want to make every post office essentially a lending spot and put taxpayers on the hook when the loans go bad and forgive them for political reasons at election time and all of that. They want to run consumer lending as a government program. And some of them have said this. I think Elizabeth Warren has said this. It's not a secret.
It's crazy, and it really then you can start to think of the implications of what that would mean for elections. The other sort of example you give is you say, suppose you could get $1,000 loan for a month that would cost you $10. That's a 1% interest rate. However, the annualized APR and suddenly it's above the 10% line. So we would
Yeah,
literally be talking about $1,000 loan at $10.
this
Would
is
be
the other
something.
thing. This is the other thing, and why I think people get confused about this debate is, when we talk about interest rates on credit cards, by law, that interest rate is expressed as an annual percentage rate. So, to get the monthly rate, you got to divide by 12. I mean, it's actually, they do a daily rate. And so it's not exact, but basically you got to divide by 12 to get the monthly rate. And so, if you're borrowing, by the way, if you borrow on a credit card for 1 month, you pay zero because they all have a grace period.
Yep.
So if you borrow for 1 month and you pay it by the due date, you pay zero. So essentially you get free loans for the first month. But let's say you carry it for another month and you incur interest. You're not going to incur interest. If you have a card that has an 18 or 20% rate on it, that's what you would pay if you carried that balance for an entire year. If you're using it just to get to the next payday, you might pay zero, or maybe if you have to pay 1 month, you might pay, a couple of percent. But when you see a card that says 24%, that means if you carry that balance for a month, it's 2%. Because the rates are expressed on an annualized basis. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind also. Now, that said, if you're carrying balances long term, you do pay a huge amount of interest. And so, the people can get in a lot of trouble with credit cards, of course. And I think we all know someone who has. But if you're using it for, an emergency situation, or if you're using it for liquidity just to get to the next payday, I mean, there are a lot of people who actually make money from using credit cards because there are all these rewards programs now and cash back and different things. And if you can pay it by the due date, you don't pay any interest at all. And in fact, you might get some money. And so, the interest is for people who are either getting in over their heads and they end up paying a lot of interest. And frankly, the banks do make a lot of money on those people, or there are people who have no better options. And, I think you need to think about these circumstances, because if somebody has no better option but to carry a credit card balance for a while, and then you take that option away, well, what do? It's easy to say, hey, you should save up first before you have big expenses. And ideally people should do that, sure. But, life is often unexpected. And the other thing, and I think this is why I'm a little bit sympathetic to what the president's talking about on this. The other thing is we just had a huge decline in real purchasing power because of all of the inflation that we had under Biden. And so a lot of people, they were faced, you get towards the end of the month, you lost a couple $100s in purchasing power compared to what you had before, because the price of everything went up a lot more than your income did. And then you have to decide, do I make my kids go without something we used to be able to afford, or do I put it on a credit card and figure it out later? And I think a lot of people said, you know what, I'm going to bridge this with a credit card. And that's why balances have started to accumulate again. But I just think that the way to get people out of that hole is not to start talking about interest rate caps, because even if that might make sense kind of in this narrow sense, I think the president's thinking like, look, Biden inflation got all these people in a hole. Let's give them a breather with like a short-term interest rate holiday to get out of that hole. And I sort of understand the appeal of that. But as I said, once you start down that path, Democrats will say extend it forever. They'll say go even lower. And then you end up hurting those people that you were trying to help, because a lot of them will get their cards canceled.
Yeah. Well, in this situation you said there, okay, if we didn't have access to a credit card, what would those families have done? Well, they would have went without, right?
Yeah,
Or they would have got a riskier option. So ask those families that. And there seems to be like there's part of people that want to say like, look, you have a big heart, you see someone in a bad situation, you're like, yeah, that stinks. What could we do as a society to help alleviate that? But show me one example of when the government comes in and implicates price controls that ever pans out. Right. And the student loan example is sort of a good example of this. Sure, you might have said back in the 70s, hey, it stinks that some people can't really get access to these loans so they could receive higher education. So what happens? People have a big heart, the government gets involved, and now it's more expensive than ever. And the degree means less and less. And it's sort of, this is the problem with saying like, oh, well, we have this morality and we say that there needs to be certain controls on these things. It ends up unintendedly, or maybe if you're a Democrat, intentionally making the situation much more expensive for the very people that you claim to want to help.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, we've had so many experiences where price controls are put in and they cause shortages and other problems and disruptions, and they end up harming people. And the challenge that we've got, though, and this is not a problem confined to the Democrats. Also, we've seen a bunch of price control proposals from Republicans. I mean, the challenge is a price control is super, super easy to explain the benefit of, right? This is going to cost less. We're going to order that it costs less. And look at rent control, Rob.
Yep.
There is no proposition in economics more proven than rent control causes disastrous underinvestment in housing. You have less housing stock. It exacerbates all the problems it's intended to solve. We've seen it over and over and over again. And my favorite example of this, there was a famous Swedish economist once who said that there's no better way to destroy he said, short of bombing, there's no better way to destroy a city than rent control. And I often point out that in Vietnam, they actually said the opposite. They said that rent control destroyed housing in Vietnam when American bombs could not. They actually, there's a quote I like to use from like the Vietnamese foreign minister in 1989 that's almost exactly along those lines. It was like they tried to destroy Hanoi with their bombs and they couldn't, but we did it with rent control and we need to do better. So you have like actual full-blown communists in Vietnam that said, wait, that was a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. That was, almost 40 years ago. You had full-blown communists in Vietnam saying, no, actually rent control was a bad idea. We destroyed this city. And yet here we are in 2026. And you got a mayor of New York who's going to ratchet rent control, to a freeze of rents for the entire city, and thinks that the solution to rents is we're going to basically make it impossible for private landlords to offer housing. And, the city's going to take it all over and it's going to be great, except the city already owns, I think 500,000 housing units. They're the worst in the whole, they were the worst. They're a total disaster. The government management, but, here's the problem, right? You and I know that it's been crystal clear for decades. You got this whole history of it, but you're out on a campaign trail and you say, hey, I'm going to freeze your rent. And people say, hey, that sounds great. And they vote for you because the other side needs to explain why that wouldn't actually be a good thing and sort of, connect a lot of dots. And in a political context, just promising a price control is much easier than explaining why it won't work well. And so that's the challenge we have.
Yeah, going back to the Biden election, like it was amazing how like just as like even a political layman, you could be like, Biden's basically like, I'll send you money if you elect me. I'll send you this check. And it's like, isn't this a race to the bottom? Like, what's it going to be that we're going to have presidents just like, I'm going to cap everything you buy at $1 and we're sending you a check for 50,000, right? Vote for me. We'll figure out the details later. So yeah, I mean, and you're right. You're never going to win that arms race with Democrats. They're always going to send you more money, put more controls on stuff. I think one of the things that goes in line with you saying, like, sort of the damage of even Trump's policy here, what he suggested, sort of spiraling into something more. I didn't even know this. I was aware that he sort of was talking about embracing the Warren-Bernie plan here. But then, like, a day later, he comes out and he starts endorsing another Democrat who I'm not a big fan of, Dick Durbin's, price control on the fees when you swipe.
Yeah, swipe fees. This is... I actually am a little more worried about this one because this, I think, is much more likely to actually pass than the interest rate caps. But, there are two ways that the credit cards make money. One of them is kind of the obvious one that, if people carry a balance, they pay those high interest rates. But the other way is every time you buy something with a credit card, the merchant gets charged a transaction fee. It's usually around 2 to 3%, although it varies a lot. And that's why sometimes they'll offer you a cash discount, or they'll say we surcharge they'll pass it through, and they do have the option to do that. Although most places don't do that because they'd rather just make the sale than make someone decide how they want to pay and all that kind of thing. And interestingly, historically, before credit cards became popular, it was pretty expensive to handle all the cash that most stores handled, and they had, you have theft issues, you've got the processing, carrying the envelopes to the bank, and all of that, and so cash isn't free either. You're talking about a 2 or 3% fee on card transactions, but cash handling was probably more than that for most businesses. I won't say all businesses, because if you're like a mom and pop and you're working the register yourself, you're going to have no losses on cash, right? But if you're a big entity, you're going to have cash go missing. There are going to be a lot of issues. And so historically, the cost of cash handling was around 5% or so. Some studies had as high as 9%, but I don't really believe them. That seems too high to me. But those transaction retailers hate them. They hate them. They want them lower because they look at if you're paying a few percent off the top of everything that you sell, especially if you're a big box store, that ends up being a very big item. You end up spending a lot of money on that, and so you really want it to be lower. Now, most of them don't want it to be lower so much that they offer cash discounts, or they disincentivize credit cards with surcharges. Although some do, most don't, which I think tells you a lot about that they benefit from this arrangement. But they would love to have government lower those costs. They would love to have price controls lower those costs. Now, the thing that's really interesting, though, about the way the credit card business has developed is there was a study that the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond did a few years ago, where they looked at the margins on swipe fees, which say how much money the banks actually make from the swipe fees. And they found that if you include the rewards programs, the margins are actually negative. They actually pay out more in rewards programs than they make in swipe fees, which is kind of amazing. You would never expect a market to develop that way, right? So it's something sort of like kind of a shocking thing. But if they're making their money on the interest rate side, then they can use the money from the swipe fees to compete with the other companies by offering different, travel points, and miles and cash back and all this kind of stuff. And this has become hyper competitive. If you have the time and the interest to do it, you can usually get 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 5% cash back on stuff if you carry a whole bunch of different cards and make sure you use them for the right category and all of that. Now, that's a lot of mental effort. But if you're willing to do it, there are tons of offers out there right now. So if we had price controls on those, if the government said, no, actually now it's going to be 1% instead of 2 or 3%, it would basically kill those rewards programs. And we know this because debit cards used to have a lot of rewards programs, but debit card transactions became price controlled in Dodd-Frank. Dick Durbin put an amendment in, and those rewards programs all disappeared, because there wasn't the revenue to support them from the swipe fees. And also free checking mostly disappeared because it was supported from those fees. Obviously Capital One is an exception. It's their huge marketing thing, but millions of people lost free checking accounts, lost their debit rewards programs because those price controls were put in. And Durbin wants to do the same thing to credit cards, put the same price controls on credit card swipe fees that we have on debit. He has a different proposal that doesn't directly impose the price controls, but it sort of backdoors them by having a routing mandate so that the retailer could choose to send your transaction over a cut rate network and pay a lower fee that way. That has the same economic consequences as a price control, but now it adds the security issue of, instead of running on the Visa or MasterCard network, your transactions running on some cut rate network that might not have fraud protection, might not have security. And so that actually raises a bunch of other concerns, kind of non-economic concerns with that version of it. I think they did that so they could say, oh, it's not a price control. It's just, we're just having routing choice. And so they've used different terminology. But the bottom line is, if this passes, and there have been a bunch of efforts to put it forward as an amendment, now the president has endorsed it, which is, I think, disappointing. If this passed, I think rewards programs would disappear.
Yeah.
Some people would lose access to credit cards also, at the low end. And by the way, we might have a round of airline bankruptcies also, because airlines now make more money from their credit card partnerships than they make flying airplanes, which is another thing that's amazing to me. And it's sort of interesting how sometimes markets develop in a way no one would have expected. But I think this would be pretty bad. This is not going to cause hundreds of millions of people to lose their cards like the the rate caps would. But this would cause most people to lose their rewards programs, other than, the most desirable customers. And, it's nice to get the 2% back or 3% or whatever you get. And so I think it would be very unpopular if they actually passed something like this. Obviously, the retailers would love it because their fees would go down. So it'd be good for retail. But I think for most consumers, it'd be pretty bad.
Yeah, and like one of the things you said there, it's a little thing, but I think it's important. The idea of fraud protection. So for me, like I remember coming to the realization like 10 years ago or something that it was a really bad idea to swipe my debit card everywhere, right? Because if some fraud skims that or takes money out, I'm not going to get my money back. Credit card, it's different, right? When you're swiping that and someone takes money, you can challenge those fees
Yeah.
if it's fraudulent. And I think what you're likely to
Visa
see.
and MasterCard are really, really good at fraud detection. They've invested a huge amount. They've got neural networks. They've got I think we've all got like pop-up messages and text and
Yep.
automated calls. Did you make this transaction? They really watch for everything that looks suspicious. And they also have zero liability. So if you are a victim of fraud, you're correct. You won't pay for it. The bank will make you whole if they can't get the money back from the fraudster. Now, if the government says that when you swipe your card, the merchant gets to decide whether it runs on the Visa or MasterCard network or whether it runs on some other network that's less expensive for them, if they get to choose instead of you, which is what this Durbin-Marshall bill would do. You might think you're buying something on Visa and you hand your card that has a Visa logo on it, but it also runs on some other non-Visa network that doesn't have those protections. And now you get a victim. Now you're a victim of fraud and you might not recover your money, or the government might try to mandate it, but then they're going to have the same issue with the cost structure. So it's, to me, this idea that, instead of just directly imposing the price control, they're going to use this routing, choice where the merchant gets to choose what network it runs on and they can lower their costs that way. It actually makes it worse in a way, because to your point, now you've introduced now you have the same economic consequence that you've sort of used government to force down the price. And that means that the money's not going to be there for the rewards program and so forth. But now you've introduced this other element of sort of a non-economic harm, although I guess it's an economic harm too if you're a victim of fraud, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You've created this security issue as well, because you've done it not just by imposing a price control on the Visa network, but by letting the merchant run it on a completely separate network.
So I think if you're watching, and probably if you're watching me, you tend to lean more towards being a Trump supporter or a Republican. So I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to ask, any time that the government's coming in and talking about a price control, what are the unintended consequences of that? And politically, will you ever win that battle? Because Democrats are going to be willing to go further. So anyone who's listening, it's like, but I know people in credit card debt and this would be helpful. But think of what those unintended consequences would be. And I think that that's what we need to focus on as conservatives, because so much it's easy to get lost in the shuffle and say, yeah, okay, free market principles don't apply now. Things have changed. And every time we have that thought, we end up worse off 5 years down the road. So
absolutely. The other thing, Rob, I think, what Trump was trying to get at was this problem of so many people are in the hole because prices went up so much faster than incomes under Biden. But, we're now a year into digging out of that hole, and we're mostly out of it. I think real incomes rose about $2,400 for the middle income family last year, which is to say incomes rose that much higher than the increase in prices. So we're well on our way to digging out of the hole. And, I think if we have another year like this past year, or even better in terms of economic growth, which is very possible, then we are going to have people for the first time in 5 or 6 years who actually feel, hey, this is the most purchasing power I've ever had. I'm actually back. I'm back, on top. I can not only afford everything I used to be able to afford, but a little more. And I expect that when that happens, the psychology is going to turn a lot more positive on the economy. I think one of the reasons people don't feel as good about the economy as they should, based on what we've seen over the past year, is a lot of them are still not all the way out of the hole, because everything got so much more expensive under Biden that incomes haven't totally caught up to that yet. I think when incomes have totally caught up to that, people are going to feel a lot better off. And that's where, if they were carrying credit card debt, they're going to be able to pay it off and get out of that hole also, and sort of feel much better about themselves. And so to me, I think Trump should focus less on kind of like, how do I soften the blow of the disaster we had under Biden, and more on just, doing, the deregulation and the tax policy, and getting some spending restraint, getting the ingredients in place so that the economy is growing so strongly that we can solve these problems that way, I think is a much better focus for him. And I think he is doing those things.
I totally agree. Last question, I'll get you out on this. I know you're a big Mets fan. What do you think? You liking the chances this year? Or you like me, a Pirates fan, where you're optimistic until mid-April and you're like, here we go again?
Well, the Pirates made some interesting moves.
Yeah.
They made some interesting moves. They're spending some money now, so maybe they see a contention window opening. We'll see. We'll see. The Mets had actually a pretty good offense last year, which is why it was a little weird that they blew it all up. And it might have been political, by the way. They seem to have gotten rid of all the Trump supporters on the team, which means they sort of chose their side. And Lindor's wife was on the inaugural committee for Mamdani, so I don't know. But look, I think the offense is very different than it was last year, but it's still going to be a good offense. You still have Lindor and Soto. I think they're going to score runs. The question is whether the starting pitching can be competent. It completely imploded last year. And when your starters are going 4 innings every day, it doesn't matter how good your bullpen is. It's going to be overworked and it's going to collapse. And that's what happened to them. And so, look, I think they gave up a lot for Peralta, but they had to do it. So now they've got stability at the top of the rotation. If McClain is as good as he looked last year, and he's looked good again so far this spring, then we basically have, 2 kind of good starters at the top of the rotation. And then we got a lot of other guys. And if some of them step up and produce, I do think this is a playoff team. But, look, if your starting pitching collapses again, who knows? Last year, after the year before, when they, were within 2 games of the World Series, nobody would have thought they would miss the playoffs last year, especially after they started the year so strong. And so, it's a long season. Anything can happen. I do think the offense is definitely playoff caliber, and the starting pitching should be substantially upgraded from last year. But we'll see. We'll see. I never would have predicted they'd miss the playoffs last year, so we'll see. But it'd be nice. It'd be nice to see the Pirates contend, and they are spending money. So
yeah, it's different for us than spending a little money. But everybody, Phil Kerpin, you can find him. He's president of American Commitment. I put the link there, americancommitment.org. Hopefully we can have you back on to talk about more sort of free market principles and policies coming up, and maybe some ridiculous policy debate stories. I'm sure we both have a lot of them. So,
all right, Rob, sounds good.
Thanks as always, man. You take it easy.
All right, bye.
Bye. All right. All right, can you guys hear me? Yeah, Phil Kerpin, he's excellent. Now, I'm sorry about the quick outro there. I'll tell you a little what went by. For some reason, StreamYards was messing up for both of us, so we decided to go with Zoom, but because I don't have the paid Zoom thing, you only have 40 minutes. So I was like, Phil, we're probably going to have a quick out, because I think we could have talked about the credit card stuff for, easily an hour if we wanted. So sorry that there was sort of an abrupt end there, but Phil is an amazing, amazing guy. One of the smartest people I've ever talked with, and brilliant debate mind. And also, I think a staunch supporter of small government and free markets, which, I'll be honest, I waffle on things sometimes. And when I talk to people like Phil, who I know is a very thoughtful, smart person who's advocating for these policies because he truly does care about America, it really does help put things in perspective. And so when I was looking into a lot of the stuff that he's talking about here, on one hand, you're like, oh my goodness, but I know someone who's paying out the nose for credit card fees and interest rates, etc. But what are the consequences of coming in and saying yeah, we're just gonna cap this at 10% APR? Remember, and I think the part that really was shocking about his op-ed that I was reading was the idea of if you get $1,000 loan at 1%, so you'd have to pay back $10 at the end of the month. That would be made illegal because you would have to compound it times 12 based on APR. Which would mean that would be capped. And what are the consequences of that? And who's going to pay the price for that? What's the world look like when that happens? Huge amounts of people end up losing their access to a credit card. What does it mean to waffle, to go back and forth? So, no, I thought it was important. Anytime, as far as I'm concerned, anytime Phil wants to come on and talk about anything, I'm a fan. He's a very thoughtful guy, and so, yeah, check out AmericanCommitment.org. You can see the issues right? So let's bring up just so you can see the site here real quick. You can see a lot of the issues they're talking about. Big on deregulation, defending free speech. So, great guy. Happy to talk to him. So, yeah, different show here in the morning. I hope to get to the point where I could do interviews with serious people outside the just yelling at each other debate space. And yeah, Phil's always been great for that. Also, I always have to. Not only did Phil help me out when I debated, but also he has been incredibly generous with his time, particularly when I do the 24-hour streams. He's always been there to come on and give me an hour of his time. So, really appreciate it. The daytime shows, one of the things that became difficult with the call-ins and everything was just the amount of trolls that I was getting. There were obviously the regulars that I knew, but you have no idea the amount of people behind the scenes that we had to dispense with that would call in. So the call-in show, we just figured because of that, and it's hard to vet people, and sort of, I've been getting sort of, I don't know if mass reporting's the work, but there's been increased scrutiny on me. And so it became difficult because you're always worried that you could lose your channel because you bring on a random caller that starts shouting things that violate TOS, and their intention is then to report you. It becomes a big mess. So it's unfortunate because I really did enjoy those shows, and I think the audience did. And maybe I'll try to set up some sort of vetting process so we could bring at least somewhat of those call-in shows back. But yeah, the morning show, if we would transition it into sort of an interview type show like this, I think that would be preferable. The only thing it would be better if that interview could have been in the evening, just because I think I would have had more people watching, because I think Phil deserves to have a bigger audience watching him. But hopefully we'll clip that out, and it's something that people will enjoy. But do apologize for the slight lateness. For some reason, StreamYard, what was happening is on both of our ends, on my end to him, I think, and his end to me, it was sounding incredibly choppy. Like it was lagged, and it was almost like robotic. We were unable, so we decided to go with Zoom as a backup. I think it worked fine, but look at that, 0 donos. I kind of don't care. This was an extra show. But someone could give, just a quick 500 bucks. No, I'm just kidding. He's a good guy, though. I think you guys would really like Phil Kerpin. He's a great guy. Big Mets fan. So, tonight at 8 o'clock, I'll be doing my show, Law and Order, with the great Ryan Mullally. We'll have legal issues to talk about. We'll probably talk about legal issues. Can Trump order these strikes with international policy? Or does it violate international law? Does it violate domestic law? There is the tariff rolling. I mean, I talk to Ryan about this all the time, but it is amazing to me, like, how big 2 weeks is, because we do this show every 2 weeks, right? The amount of issues and stories that come up in 2 weeks now are unbelievable. Literally the day or two after Ryan and I did our last show 2 Mondays ago, we had the Supreme Court rule basically against Trump's tariffs. Does anybody even remember that? It seems like a lifetime ago at this point. And it's one of the things that I have to remind myself, but I do say all the time. The news cycle moves so fast that oftentimes the issue that you're like, wow, this is huge today, by a week or two, it's like, we're on to something completely different. So I just don't know. It's pretty crazy. And also this show wasn't on Rumble. It's because for some reason Rumble will only let me set up one stream at a time. So I wanted to get this stream set up because I knew the notifications would be lacking for a 10 a.m. show. So I wanted to make sure this was set up yesterday, that I could send the invite link, etc., to my guest. Rumble, then, when I did my show last night, Rumble just totally screws the pooch, and it's like, nope, you can only have one stream up at a time. So, super chats. Chop, thanks for the 20, man. Appreciate it. John Ruck, it's $2. Thank you. Grid, what's happening, my man? $20. Thanks so much this morning. Good morning to you, man. Hope everything's going well. So yeah, that show with me and Ryan will be tonight. Last night, I got bogged down into the Epstein stuff. We didn't talk a lot about the Iran attacks. I also had other stories that I wanted to talk about, particularly the NAACP Image Awards and how fragile these black actors are. That they're like, they achieved some great victory over a man with Tourette's that shouted a bad word. Like, what are we doing? What are we doing as a society? It's just so maybe we'll cover more of that today, and I'm sure there'll be more fallout that we'll see today. It's very difficult to know what's true. It is clear. It is clear that there is so much blatant propaganda and misleading information going out there. Like I just scroll X and I'll see every other post will be like, Iran just completely wiped out a U.S. base in this area. Most devastating American loss since like the Vietnam War. And then you click on it and people are like, these images are AI generated. There's no evidence that this occurred, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know. Abel, thanks so much for the $2. Says, Rob, it's time to go on Joe Rogan. Oh, I don't know that I'm big enough yet. I mean, if Joe Rogan called me, I would go. But I don't know that I'm big enough yet. It would be fun though. Paulie Shortcut says it's clear we're in over our heads. You think that's clear? I don't think that's clear right now. That may absolutely be the case. I don't think it's clear right now. What is the damage so far? It seems that Iran just lashed out. Like they ended up hitting a bunch of Arab nations like Qatar that in the past would have been more likely to agree with Iran on some issues. I don't know. If there were pilots that crashed in Kuwait, apparently it was a misunderstanding. The pilots are safe. 3 people died. 3 U.S. service members died. I don't know the details. That's being reported, though, but I don't know the details of how they died. It seems that was likely in the initial attack. As far as, I think, at least in Bahrain, there is evidence that some U.S. sites were hit. I haven't seen any casualties reported from that. I would think there's likely probably more U.S. casualties than we've been told. And don't get me wrong, every loss of life from the perspective of an American, period, sucks. Right? But certainly from the American soldier's perspective. But I think most people, if you're being honest, let's say that there would be no more U.S. loss of life. Most people, if they would be honest, would say, wow, complete regime change, take out the entire regime of Iran, and it resulted in 3 American deaths. You would expect it to be way worse, I think, based on the perceived strength. I don't know. Like, I don't know the details. And then there's a secondary question of, even if we're not talking about just the ability of Iran to respond conventionally, like with missiles, etc., what about sleeper cells? And I think you're likely to see that there will be probably more casualties as a result of that than, at least for the U.S., than of just straight attacks. Abel, thanks again for $2. As Rachel mentioned you, so who knows? Yeah, she did. And I can't thank Rachel enough for mentioning me over there on Joe Rogan. And then the great Zach Gelpy, $10 says, great show last night, Rob. I caught it this morning. I'll rewatch this one later today, but it seems like a good. Thank you. Yeah, you would really like Phil Kerpin, Zach. He would be very much in line with a lot of your political opinions. And last night I fell into the trap of course, talking about the Epstein stuff again, and it's just infuriating. And like, I don't know. I guess there's two things to say about it in general about last night. Is one, and most importantly, I guess, is that I'm terrible. I can't help but focus on the people that are disagreeing with me. And I'll talk for hours and hours and hours on that, even if it's just spinning your wheels. So that's the first thing, and that's on me. It's not the fault of the people that are continuing to make the point. I guess it's my fault. And then the other thing is, I don't know that there's any convincing people that have made up their minds to that extent. Even if, like, the people that are like, this is all ploy by Israel, they control everything. This is all, Trump's on the Epstein stuff, they're covering it up, blah, blah, blah. I don't know that there's anything I could say. I don't think there's any evidence that could ever be presented that would change minds. And that doesn't mean that you're a piece of garbage. Like, that's fine. You've made up your mind, that's fine. But I don't know what to say other than to just shrug my shoulders. Because, like, I think on both the Epstein stuff, like last night, for example, the long Epstein discussion we get into, it was a very specific claim. Kash Patel lied to Congress. Okay. Like, can you show me, like, what is, I thought most people would say that's when he said there were no other co-conspirators. Okay, well, and then, which my answer to that was like, well, are there though? Like, are there any alive still? Even if at one point people were investigated as co-conspirators, maybe there wasn't enough after the investigation to charge them. So currently, are there outstanding co-conspirators? I don't know. Just because it's said in the past this person's being looked at as a co-conspirator doesn't mean that they are a co-conspirator. Right? But the person was like, no, there are other things. And he sent me the clip, and the one we focused on the most was the clip of Representative Kennedy, or is it Senator Kennedy? And in those clips, I'm looking at him, I'm like, I don't think this is saying what you're saying. And you could see where it was going. The reason it's important to correct the record on what seemingly benign things is because it sets a standard. And it's very much like, I'm sorry to say this, and maybe people get pissed at me for saying it, but I don't think that guy last night was a lefty, but that's what it's like arguing. Where it's just like, we'll just make 1,000 accusations. And when you go through them one by one, it's like, yeah, okay, whatever, next. Yeah, okay, whatever, next. And it's just like, and so to the point where I'm like, okay, on your hyper-specific claim here, there are people in the audience that are just like, you're defending PDFs. What are you talking about? How could anybody reasonably? How could anybody reasonably come to that conclusion that that's what I'm doing? You said Kash Patel lied in this statement. I'm like, well, where's your proof of it? Oh, you're defending PDFs. What are you talking about? How could we ever have a conversation then? How's this any different than the general Me Too movement? Oh, a woman accused a man of something. If you have any questions, then you're defending men assaulting women. Like, what are you talking about? Haven't we learned our lesson? And you might say, yeah, but it's my feeling at the end of the day that overarchingly there are things. Fair enough. You might absolutely be right. I'm just talking about the hyper-specific claims that are being made at each level. It's the same with the Iran attack. That it was Israel. It's all Israel. All I'm doing is like, it may well be. I don't see the proof of that, but okay. It may well be. I don't know. But all I'm trying to do is like start from a starting point of like, okay, I don't really like this attack. Now, let's test sort of the logic behind it. Forget about the specific details. Ask yourself this. Is there a time where we could say, yes, this sort of attack by the United States would be legitimate? And I think most people would say, sure. Maybe they're literally on the cusp, a week or two away from getting a nuclear weapon and they're going to deploy it, or there's an assassination team trying to take out Trump like currently. Whatever. We could all come up with hypothetical. Okay. Then on the opposite end, can you come up with hypothetical reasons why this would be bad, even if it seems good? Sure. It was done for personal profit and whatever, right? But to even begin to broach that level of it, people that have already made up their mind, they skip ahead. But the evidence doesn't say that. Okay, maybe not, but we're not even getting to what the evidence says yet. We're getting to, if the evidence said this, would it be acceptable? You may say no, still not. Okay, I think my personal opinion is, yeah, if the evidence said they were really close to getting a nuclear weapon, and sure. But you can't even get to that point. We know it was Israel, period, end of story. They're bad. Okay, then I guess there's nothing to talk about. And that's what I was trying to get to last night. Like, I try my best to give analogies and to make, because I don't think that I'm a high-minded person. I think that I'm just trying my best to talk to a way that average people like me would understand. Levin says, why use any other platform other than Discord? Discord's one of the worst to use, to be honest. That's why I use StreamYards normally. StreamYards, unfortunately, wasn't working for Phil. Most people that are like serious people that you're going to interview that are involved in politics or organizations, they don't have Discord. I assure you, the president of American Commitment isn't chatting people up on Discord for video games and shit. It's not happening, right? So we use Zoom because that's usually one that most people have that are out like sort of in the real political world. But there's all sorts of problems with Discord. The audio sometimes falls behind and lags. StreamYard's better in every way, and as far as I'm concerned. Abel. Should I have to worry about my 22 and 18-year-old son being drafted? I would say no. I don't think that's likely to be a case. But worthy concern, But anyways, back to the analogy I was trying to give is let's say that we say, I use the example of a woman throws boiling oil on her son. It's terrible, right? All of us are like, wow, it's horrible. Is there ever a situation where that would be justified? At first glance, you'd be like, of course not. But then it's like, well, the son had just murdered her husband and was coming at her with a weapon. Then you might say, oh, okay, that's different. Now, then you might say, okay, fine, there's a potential. And then we're like, yeah, but there's no evidence that that situation occurred. All right, right? But before you get to what the evidence says, I was actually talking to an attorney the other day, and I was unaware of this. Maybe someone knows. But there's different stages to oftentimes what you'll see in civil litigation. For example, you might file a motion to dismiss. And some of that is literally just you don't even argue the evidence. You just say, if this evidence is true that's outlined in this lawsuit, even if it's true, there's no suit here. There's no lawsuit. Then the next level is sort of, okay, but summarily, a summary look at the evidence shows that it's not true. Then you get to a trial where it's like, okay, now we're looking at the evidence. That's sort of how intuitively I look at things. I first say, okay, because here's the punchline. Everybody's going to argue about the evidence. So what you're trying to do is to get some level of agreement with everyone. Okay, can we at least, before we get to looking at the specific evidence, can we get this? Can we get some sort of agreement on what the framework is we're looking at? If Iran was about to get a nuclear weapon, would that justify an attack? Maybe you say no still, that's fine. But that's what I'm trying to do. And the problem is to even go through that level of it, the people that are that are like, no, I don't like the attack, so many of them can't understand that. They're just like, oh, so you're defending the attack. No, that's not what I'm doing. That's not what I'm doing at all. But there are unfortunately people, I don't know what it is, if it's just that they're so passionate about their position, or if they don't have the intelligence to realize what you're doing. I don't know, but they're unwilling to hear it. Well, fun. I think Phil's incredibly against regulatory capture and wants to deregulate many things. That's sort of his entire organization's point. So, anyways, that's the point that I was trying to make yesterday. And it's difficult. I understand. It was like the other day when we were talking about Virginia Giuffre, and I was like, look, Virginia Giuffre kind of really helps Trump because she's like, Trump never did anything. And then the email that was released from Epstein that's like, hey, Trump was in the room with Virginia. He's the dog that's not barking. It sort of starts to seem like Epstein was worried, Giuffre might be a victim. And Trump was talking to her. And maybe Trump's talking to the police. Right? Okay, we get that. I think most people would agree. At the very minimum, Giuffre's not bad for Trump. And in some degree, tangentially, it sort of helps paint Trump in a better light. I support Trump. And yet, I was like, listen, she's retracted things she said in the past. Why do we just, at face value, accept what Giuffre said? Maybe, right? Now, there was one person that reached out to me and was like, how dare you? You're saying Trump did this. No, I'm just saying I'm trying my best to look at each specific piece of evidence and say, well, what's the possibilities with this? That's it. So I hope that helps clear it up a little. I know I get a little frustrated when I'm arguing with people. But that's my attempt, what I'm trying to do. And if you hate that, and if you think that makes me an Israeli shill, or that I'm covering up for, offenders that are in the Epstein list, I don't know what to say to you. I don't feel that way, but fair enough if that's how you feel. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed this interview. I'm going to head out. I think that me and the wife are going to go get some lunch. So I will be back around 8 p.m. Eastern tonight with Law and Order. I think it'll be a good show. We'll certainly have a lot to talk about. Let's see if anyone's streaming right now that we could raid over to. No one. Goodness gracious. See, no one does these morning shows. I would like to start doing the daytime shows again. Stay tuned. There might be announcements coming up in the near future about that. But what I will say is, no, we didn't do a siege last night. We just did a regular show. Again, the Collins show became too difficult with the amount of trolls and everything, which is unfortunate, but who knows? Maybe we'll deal with, find some ways to work around that. But I am working on some stuff about potential streaming at different times and things of that nature. So, but last thing I'll say is, if you're interested in my guest for today, Phil Kerpin, who I can't speak highly enough of. I think that he is an amazing guy. One of the only sort of right-wing people in debate. Objectively, a much smarter guy than me. He's a really good guy. Please consider checking out his organization's website. That's AmericanCommitment.org. And I think you'll see some good resources if you're sort of a small government deregulation conservative, of a lot of good resources there, policies that are being debated right now, issues that should be being pushed for, particularly from Republicans. I think it's a good source of information. So please consider checking out. It's AmericanCommitment.org. And you can see a lot of the writings. Phil also writes for like the Washington Examiner, other places of that nature. So, all right. I will let you guys go. We're not going to do any big outro here tonight. Thank you so much to my guest, Phil Kerpin. Thank you to all my mods. Thank you to everyone who donated. You guys are the best. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who chatted, liked, etc. You guys are the best. So we'll talk to you all tonight, 8 p.m. Eastern, Law and Order. Thanks so much, everyone. As always, have a good one.